The woman at the Tim Hortons counter didn't look like someone who would change my life. She was ahead of me in line, digging through her purse with the kind of slow, careful movements that told me her hands were bothering her that morning. Arthritis, maybe. My late wife had the same look when the cold got into her joints. The young cashier waited, not unkindly, while the woman counted coins onto the counter. I could see from where I stood that she was coming up short. She knew it too. Her shoulders dropped just slightly, the way a person's do when they're embarrassed and trying not to show it. I stepped forward and told the cashier to put it on mine. The woman turned around. She was in her mid-80s, I guess, with sharp blue eyes that didn't match the rest of how tired she looked. She wore a heavy wool coat, the kind people don't make anymore, with buttons done up to the throat even though it wasn't that cold inside. She said she couldn't accept that. I told her it was just coffee. And a muffin, I added, because I'd seen her eyeing the blueberry ones. She laughed at that. A real laugh, not the polite kind. Then she said, "Sit with me a minute, would you? I don't bite." So I did. I had nowhere to be. That's the thing about being 63 and retired and living alone on 40 acres outside of Orangeville. Nowhere to be becomes a way of life after a while. Some days you don't mind it. Some days it settles on you like weather. Her name was Agnes. She'd been coming to this Tim Hortons every Tuesday for 11 years, she said, ever since her husband passed and the house got quiet. I understood that more than I told her. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. She asked about my property, seemed genuinely interested when I mentioned the woodlot and the old equipment barn my father had built in 1962. She asked if I had family nearby. I told her my son lived in Calgary. Good kid, steady job, called every Sunday. Then I mentioned my daughter Renee, who lived 40 minutes away in Brampton with her husband Dax. Something shifted in Agnes's face when I said their names. Not dramatic, just a small tightening around the eyes, like she was deciding something. She put her coffee down and folded her hands on the table. "Your daughter," she said. "Does she come around often?" I told her Renee had been coming out to the property almost every weekend lately. Said she was worried about me being out there alone. Wanted to help me sort through things, she said. Her husband had been coming too, helping with odd jobs around the place. Agnes nodded slowly. Then she looked at me directly and said, "When she leaves on Sunday, don't go into your barn. Don't move anything in there, not until you've had someone else with you." I must have looked at her the way anyone would look at a stranger who says something like that out of nowhere. Confused. A little concerned about her, honestly. She didn't explain. She just said, "I know how that sounds. I'm sorry, but I mean it." Then she picked up her muffin, thanked me for the coffee, and left. I sat there for a few minutes after she was gone. Told myself she was a sweet old woman, probably a little lonely, maybe a bit confused. Told myself I'd been too quick to read something meaningful into it. But I didn't forget it either. Here's what you need to know about my daughter. Renee was born when I was 31. She came out swinging, my wife used to say, opinionated and fierce from the start, the kind of child who'd argue with a stop sign if she thought it was wrong. We clashed when she was a teenager, same as most fathers and daughters do, but we came out the other side of it okay? Or I thought we did. She married Dax 8 years ago. He's in finance. Not a bad-looking man, keeps himself neat, says the right things at the right times. I never warmed to him fully, but I told myself that was just the father in me being territorial. My wife liked him well enough, and that counted for something. When my wife, Helen, died 3 years ago, everything changed in ways I'm still sorting out. The property, the house, the barn, the 40 acres, had been in my family for 2 generations. My father farmed it. Then I ran a small landscaping operation out of it for 30 years. I kept it up since retiring, more out of habit and love than necessity. Helen and I had talked about the estate more than once, The understanding was always that it would be split equally between Renee and our son Stuart. That was the plan. We had a will that said so. What I didn't know, until much later, was that Renee and Dax had started doing the math on what the property was worth. And somewhere along the way, equal stopped being enough for them. I didn't see it at first because I wasn't looking. She was my daughter. When she started coming out weekends, asking about the equipment in the barn, asking if I'd thought about what I wanted to do with the tractor, the tools, the old lumber, I thought she was just being practical, clearing things up, getting ahead of grief maybe, the way some people do. When Dax started volunteering to help, I was grateful. It's hard to keep up a property by yourself at my age. My back isn't what it was. I let him do things, move things, help me carry boxes from the barn to the house and back again. I should have been paying more attention to what exactly he was moving. The Sunday after I met Agnes was cold and gray, the way March in Ontario gets when it can't quite decide whether it's still winter. Renee and Dax arrived around noon with a casserole and a lot of questions about my property tax situation. That last part should have told me something right there. Renee wanted to look through the filing cabinet in the front room. Said she just wanted to make sure everything was organized, that she worried about me keeping track of things on my own. I let her. Dax wandered out to the barn while she did it. Said he was going to check on the tractor because it had been idling rough the last time I'd used it. Looking back, I understand now that the visits had a pattern I hadn't clocked. Dax in the barn, Renee with the paperwork. The two of them, together, building a picture of everything I owned and where I kept it. They left around 4 that afternoon. Renee hugged me at the door and told me she loved me and that she was going to look into some financial planning options for me, that there were programs for seniors with rural property in Ontario that I probably didn't know about. She said it like she was doing me a favor. After I watched their car go down the drive, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Agnes had said, "Don't go into the barn. Not until you've had someone else with you." I called my son. Stuart picked up on the second ring, which was unusual for a Sunday evening. I told him I needed him to come out, that I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but that I'd feel better if he was here when I looked. I told him what Agnes had said. There was a pause. Then he said, "Dad, I'll be there Friday." I didn't go into the barn that week. It took more willpower than I expected, because every morning I woke up thinking about it, and every day I found a reason to walk out to the property line and stand there looking at the barn door without going in. It was stupid, maybe. The barn had been mine for 30 years. I had every right to walk into it whenever I wanted. But something about the way Agnes had said it kept stopping me. She'd looked at me like a person who knew something, not like she was confused or performing, like someone carrying information they didn't fully want to have. Stuart arrived on Friday evening with his wife and their youngest. We had dinner. We talked about nothing important. And after the kids were in bed and his wife had gone up to read, Stuart and I put on our coats and walked out to the barn with flashlights. The barn was as I'd left it mostly. My father's old tools on the north wall, the tractor in the middle bay, stacked lumber along the back that I'd been meaning to sell for 2 years. Stuart went slowly, methodically. He's like his mother that way. Systematic, doesn't rush. He found it behind the lumber stack. A gap in the floorboard, about 18 inches square, that I had not made and had not known was there. The boards had been pried up and reset so cleanly that you'd never notice unless you were on your hands and knees with a flashlight and looking for something wrong. Inside the gap was a fireproof document box. Inside the box was a copy of my will. But it wasn't my will, not exactly. It was my will with changes made to it. 2 pages had been reprinted and substituted. The language was close enough to the original that a quick read wouldn't catch it, but the effect was clear. In this version, the property would go entirely to Renee. Stuart was effectively removed, given a token amount, a figure low enough that it would barely cover the legal fees to challenge it. There was also a folded piece of paper in the bottom of the box. It was a notarized signature, mine, or something that was meant to look like mine on a document authorizing Renee as sole power of attorney. I have no memory of signing any such document, because I didn't. Stuart and I stood in that barn for a long time without talking. Finally, he said, "Dad, how long has Dax been coming out here?" "About 4 months," I told him. He nodded, like that was the answer he expected. We left everything exactly as we found it, replaced the floorboards, walked back to the house, sat at the kitchen table and didn't sleep for most of the night. In the morning, I called my lawyer. His name is Gordon. I've known him for 22 years. He handled the deed when I bought out my cousin's share of the property back in 2001, and he's one of the few people I trust entirely. I told him what we'd found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said to bring him everything, that I should not touch the documents except to put them in a sealed bag, and that I should not mention any of this to Renee or Dax. He also told me to contact the Ontario Provincial Police. I want to tell you that made things feel more manageable. It didn't. What it felt like was grief, because whatever was going to happen next, I was going to have to look at my daughter and know what she had tried to do. The OPP officer who came out was professional and calm. She photographed everything, took the box into evidence, and explained the process to me in plain language. Forgery, fraud, breach of trust. The words sat in my chest like stones. I asked her at one point whether she thought they'd actually go through with it, whether maybe this was something they'd started and hadn't finished, that maybe it was more complicated than it looked. She didn't answer that directly. She just said, "Sir, the hole in your floor was carefully made. The documents were prepared over time. This wasn't impulsive." That was the moment I stopped hoping there was an innocent explanation. What happened over the next 2 months was slow and procedural, the way these things always are. The investigation moved at its own pace. I went to my lawyer's office more times than I can count. I revised my actual will with Gordon present and properly witnessed. I had the property reassessed and the deed verified. Renee called me twice during that period. Both times I kept the conversation short and gave her nothing. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, talking to my daughter on the phone like she was an acquaintance, keeping my voice even, not letting her hear what I knew. Dex called once. He said he'd been thinking about coming out to finish some work in the barn, asked if that weekend was good. I told him I had company coming. He said no problem, another time. He never got another time. The charges came down in May. Dax was named in all of them. Renee was named in 2. I found out through Gordon, who called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen when he told me, looking out the window at the property my father had built and that I had spent 30 years maintaining. I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. Stuart called that evening. He'd already heard. His voice was careful, the way it gets when he's trying not to show that he's been crying. He said, "She was there for the forgery, Dad. They found messages. She knew." I already knew, but hearing it from my son, out loud, in actual words, is a different thing from knowing it silently. The legal process is ongoing, as these things are. I won't pretend I understand all of it. What I understand is that the falsified documents are in the hands of the Crown, that both Renee and Dax have retained lawyers, and that there will eventually be a proceeding that I'll have to be part of. My actual will has been revised, properly, with Stuart and a colleague of Gordon's as witnesses. The power of attorney that was forged has been formally declared invalid. My solicitor advised me to have the property formally assessed and the deed status confirmed. All of that has been done. There are loose ends, the way there always are. My relationship with my daughter is in a state I don't have a word for yet. She hasn't reached out since the charges. I don't know if I would know what to say if she did. I have a lot of nights where I sit in the kitchen that Helen and I shared for 30 years and try to find the version of Renee I raised in all of this. The girl who argued with stop signs, who cried at my father's funeral, who called me from the hospital the night her own daughter was born. And I can't always find her. That's the part nobody tells you about. The paperwork gets resolved, the evidence gets processed, the law moves forward in its deliberate, impersonal way. The grief doesn't follow the same schedule. I went back to the Tim Hortons on a Tuesday in April, about 6 weeks after the charges came down. I'm not sure why exactly. Something like needing to close a circle, I suppose. Agnes was there. She was in the same seat, same wool coat, same blueberry muffin. She looked up when I came in, and her expression did something complicated, like she'd been expecting me, but wasn't sure how to feel about it. I got 2 coffees and sat down across from her. She asked how I was. I told her, in broad terms without the details, that I'd listened to her, that something had been found, that it was being dealt with. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said she was glad. Then she said, I wasn't sure whether to say anything. I almost didn't. I asked her how she'd known. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had a grandson who was a notary, that some months back he had told her in strict confidence and without names about an irregular request that had troubled him. He had refused the request, she said, but it had stayed with him, and he had told her about it in the way people sometimes offload things they can't do anything more about. She had known it was my daughter. She'd only put it together because I'd mentioned Renee's name at our first meeting, and the details her grandson had described matched up in a way she couldn't ignore. So she had said something. She had taken a stranger at his word, given him a warning, and let him decide what to do with it. She looked at me steadily across the table. You paid for my coffee, she said. I owed you something better than that. I thought about my father, who built the barn now sitting quietly on 40 acres that are still mine. I thought about Helen, who would have known something was wrong long before I did. I thought about Stuart, on his hands and knees with a flashlight, moving carefully through the dark. I told Agnes that she'd given me considerably more than a coffee's worth. She laughed again, that real one, not the polite kind. We sat there until the Tuesday regulars started drifting in, and then we said goodbye like people who might see each other again, or might not, and who have made their peace with not knowing which it will be. The drive back to Orangeville is 40 minutes on a good day. The land opens up past Brampton, the way Ontario does when the suburbs finally exhale. Fields, tree lines, the long flat sky. I've driven that road more times than I can count, through every season, at every hour of the day and night. That afternoon it looked like something I wanted to keep, and it still is mine. I think about the small decisions a lot, not the big ones, not calling Gordon, not waiting for Stuart, not going to the OPP. Those felt enormous at the time, but they were obvious once I had something to act on. The one I keep coming back to is the 20 minutes I spent sitting across from an old woman at a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning, listening to her instead of dismissing her. That was the decision that cost me nothing and gave me everything. There's a version of that morning where I smile politely, tell her I'll keep it in mind, and drive home thinking she was a sweet lady who'd had too much time alone with her thoughts. I'd have gone into that barn the following weekend. Dax would have been standing right beside me. Whatever came next would have been on their terms, not mine. What Agnes did required something from her that I don't think gets named often enough. It would have been easier, far easier, to say nothing. She had second-hand information, an elderly woman connecting dots that weren't even fully hers to connect. She could have told herself it wasn't her place, that she might be wrong, that strangers don't owe each other that kind of difficult honesty. She said something anyway. That's not a small thing. I've spent a good part of my life assuming that integrity was something you either had or didn't, a fixed trait, like eye color. What I understand now is that it's more like a muscle. You use it in the small moments, the cheap ones, and then when a moment comes along that costs you something real, you find out whether you've been keeping it in shape. Agnes had, I hope I have too, in ways I won't always see the results of. Stuart, on his hands and knees in that barn with a flashlight. I think about that too. He drove from Calgary on a phone call from his father that didn't even explain what we were looking for. He came because I asked. He was careful and methodical. And when he found what was under those floorboards, he didn't panic. And he didn't act before we'd thought it through. That kind of steadiness doesn't appear from nowhere. It comes from years of choosing the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, in small situations and large ones, until it becomes the way you move through the world. What Renee and Dax built, the plan, the documents, the months of patient preparation, required intelligence, real effort. And it came to nothing, not because they were careless, but because they forgot that other people are also paying attention. You cannot read people only for what you can take from them. At some point the accounting catches up. The property is still mine. The barn is still standing. On clear evenings, I walk out there and stand in the doorway the way my father used to, looking at the woodlot past the fence line, and I think about what it means to have kept something worth keeping. Not just the land, the way I held myself through all of it. That's the part I'll carry longest.